The words hit me like a slap. "We're done feeding you." Still, I don't react. Instead, I pull up his account, my fingers steady as I freeze his access. The silence in the room grows, filled with the weight of my decision. While he's out there, thinking he's won, I realize just how long I've been invisible in our relationship. That's when it hits me. He's never truly valued me, and now, the power has shifted. I close my eyes, knowing I've finally reclaimed control. This time, I'm the one teaching him a lesson. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Maggie sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the otherwise quiet room. She picked up her fork and poked at the scrambled eggs. The warmth from the food contrasting with the chill she suddenly felt in her chest. It wasn't hunger that had soured her appetite. It was James. Her son, seated across from her, shoveled a mouthful of eggs into his own plate, chewing casually, his eyes flicking to his phone for a moment before landing on her. The same eyes that had once looked up to her with admiration, now cold and indifferent. "We're done feeding you," James said, his voice flat. "You need to figure this out on your own." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Maggie felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. Her hand froze mid-air, the fork held loosely between her fingers. Her heart didn't just sink, it felt like it had vanished entirely, leaving her empty, hollow. "Done feeding you." Those words echoed in her mind, louder than any sound she'd ever heard. James didn't look sorry. He didn't even seem to care. He went on eating like nothing had happened, shoveling more eggs onto his plate as if he hadn't just torn apart everything that had once been sacred to her. The years of sacrifice, the sleepless nights, the endless giving. He looked at her briefly, shrugging as if the weight of his words was nothing more than a passing thought. "You've got enough savings to take care of yourself. Just figure it out." Maggie blinked, struggling to find her voice. She wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, but the words stuck in her throat like bitter ash. Her hand gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. Across the table, Lily sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze flicking between the two of them. She looked small in that moment, unsure of where to place her loyalty, how to react. Maggie saw the hesitation in her daughter's eyes, the confusion, the unspoken plea for peace. But there would be no peace here, not today. Maggie's gaze dropped to the half-empty plate in front of her. The eggs had gone cold. She no longer cared about food. Her thoughts swirled, but they weren't clear. The sting of James's words blurred everything. She tried to process them, to make sense of the sudden shift in their relationship, but the more she thought, the angrier she became. "Feeding you." That's what he said, as if she'd ever been a burden to him, as if she hadn't spent years building the life they all lived in, sustaining it, pouring herself into them. But now, according to James, she was just an inconvenience, a problem to be solved. Maggie felt her pulse quicken, her chest tightening with a sense of injustice that made her head spin. She should have said something. She should have fought back. But instead, she sat there, frozen. Lily's voice broke the silence. "James, maybe—" But she stopped, her words trailing off into the thick air. She knew there was no point. She wasn't going to fix this. Neither of them would. Maggie turned her gaze away from Lily, her thoughts a tangled mess of emotions. She couldn't be weak. Not now. She would not be weak. There was no going back from this. Her son, her flesh and blood, had just dismissed her like she was nothing. Her hand trembled as she set the fork down with a quiet clink, the noise sharp in the stillness. She didn't look at James. She couldn't. James didn't seem to care that he'd just shattered something precious. something that had held their family together for years. He just shoved his plate away and grabbed his phone again, scrolling as if everything was normal. "Let me know when you get your act together," he muttered without looking up. Maggie's mind buzzed with 1,000 thoughts: anger, confusion, pain. But underneath it all, something else began to stir. A quiet, steady resolve. She had given her all to this family, but she had been invisible. Invisible. For the first time in a long time, Maggie felt the seed of something new taking root inside her. It was small, a whisper at first, but it was there. Enough. She straightened in her chair, the pressure in her chest lifting ever so slightly. Her eyes flicked to Lily, who was still staring at James, her face a mixture of concern and helplessness. Maggie offered a tight smile, but her heart wasn't in it. Not anymore. "I'll figure it out," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside. She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate, and turned away, leaving the kitchen behind. But as she walked down the hallway toward the stairs, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that she wasn't the same woman who had sat down at that table. And James? He had no idea what he'd just done. The door to her bedroom closed quietly behind her. She stood there for a moment, her back pressed against it, taking a deep breath. Maggie didn't know what she was going to do next, but one thing was clear: the days of being fed were over. The silence in Maggie's bedroom was thick and suffocating. She stood at the foot of her bed, staring at the empty space where Thomas's old side of the bed had been. It still felt like he was just in the other room, still felt like he'd be walking through the door any minute. But he wasn't. And now, the absence of her husband wasn't the only emptiness she had to grapple with. She had replayed James's words over and over again in her mind, each repetition more painful than the last. "We're done feeding you." It wasn't just a blow to her pride, it felt like the end of a chapter she'd been writing for years. She had given everything to this family, her entire life. Her entire life. She'd worked, sacrificed, and given up so much for them, for James. But now it was clear. She was just a thing to be discarded, something to be cast aside when no longer needed. Maggie sank onto the edge of the bed, her fingers digging into the fabric of the quilt. The soft pattern of roses on the faded fabric seemed so out of place in this moment. It was supposed to be a symbol of family warmth, something Thomas had always loved. She couldn't look at it the same way now. She couldn't look at anything the same way. She thought of the years she'd spent working. She thought of the nights she stayed awake, worrying over bills, keeping the house in order, making sure James and Lily had everything they needed. She'd run herself ragged, never asking for help, never expecting it. She had always been the one who gave. Always. But now it seemed like all that had been in vain. Her mind drifted back to Thomas, the man who had been her partner, her equal. Together, they had built this life. Together, they had dreamed of a future where their children would carry the weight of the family when they were gone. But now Thomas was gone, and James had made it clear that he didn't want to be part of that dream anymore. Maggie's chest tightened as she thought of her late husband's warm smile, the way he used to hold her hand whenever they'd sit down at the kitchen table, talking about everything and nothing. They'd been a team. But now that he was gone, it seemed like she was just left behind, forgotten. No one needed her anymore. Not James. Not even Lily, who was so caught in the middle, unsure of how to navigate this new, fractured reality. The pain of being discarded by her own son, by the person she had given so much to, transformed into something else. Anger. It wasn't a loud, fiery anger. It was quiet, calculated, cold. Maggie could feel it simmering inside her, rising slowly but steadily. She wasn't going to be pushed aside. Not anymore. For the first time in what felt like years, Maggie felt a fire ignite deep within her. She had been invisible. She had been giving, sacrificing, and pouring herself into a family that seemed to take it all for granted. But no longer. She wasn't going to let this continue. No more. She wasn't going to let James, or anyone else, treat her like she was nothing. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, and she stood up from the bed with a newfound sense of purpose. She would no longer be the invisible woman in the background, quietly supporting everyone else while she was left with nothing. It was time for her to be seen. The more she thought about it, the more the decision began to form in her mind. It was time to take control of her life, her own life. Maggie had given everything for her family, but now it was her turn. She wasn't going to beg for anyone's approval. She wasn't going to let James dictate her worth anymore. She thought of all the sacrifices she'd made over the years, and she thought of the one thing she still had left: herself. She wasn't going to lose that too. She deserved more than this. More than a son who saw her as a burden. More than the woman she had become. A shadow of herself. Just existing. Maggie walked over to the window and looked out at the quiet suburban street. The world outside was unchanged. The trees swayed gently in the breeze. The houses across the street still stood with their white picket fences, their neat lawns. But to Maggie, it all seemed distant now. She wasn't part of it anymore. She had been part of something once, but now she had to rebuild it. For the first time in years, Maggie realized something. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't just about the house, the bills, or the things she had given up. It was about something bigger. It was about control. It was about her right to take up space, to have a voice. It was about reclaiming herself from the life she'd put aside for everyone else. Maggie turned away from the window, her mind made up. She had a plan now, and James wouldn't know what hit him. Her heart was still pounding, but there was no fear this time, just determination. The past was behind her. It was time to step forward. She picked up her phone, and for the first time, her fingers didn't hesitate. She had something to do now. It was time to stop being invisible. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, she'd make sure James knew exactly what she was capable of. Maggie stared at the phone, her breath steadying. The decision had been made. Maggie sat at the small desk in her bedroom, the glow of the computer screen casting a soft light in the otherwise dim room. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, the decision already made but needing to be enacted. She had spent the last few hours thinking through everything, and now it was time to do something about it. She opened her bank account, the familiar interface appearing in front of her. The numbers on the screen felt distant, disconnected from the emotions swirling inside her. Maggie scrolled slowly, taking in the balances, the savings, the investments. She'd worked hard for this money, earned it with every hour spent grinding away at the desk, never asking for anything in return except the quiet satisfaction of knowing she was providing. And yet, it had all been so easily taken for granted by James. Her eyes moved across the numbers, but then, as if on autopilot, they slid to the second account. James's account, linked directly to hers, as it always had been. For emergencies, she had told herself. Just in case. Her fingers trembled slightly as she clicked on it. His balance was higher than hers, unsurprisingly. Maggie had always let him have more access, more freedom with his spending, thinking it was his right, that it was just part of being a family. She had been too trusting. As the figures flashed on the screen, Maggie felt a dull ache in her chest. She'd been paying for his mistakes all these years, the car repairs, the credit card debts, the constant cash flow he had needed for his business ventures, the ones that had never really panned out. All those things had been taken care of by her, out of her own account, her own hard-earned savings, all those years of support, of trusting him, believing in him. But now, Maggie felt the sting of betrayal. She had enabled him. She had let him take advantage of her. The thought was both sobering and liberating. She wasn't some helpless woman being dragged along. She had given this power away. And now she was taking it back. Maggie leaned forward in her chair, her elbows on the desk as she stared at the numbers in front of her. The bank was just a tool, a structure, but it was the control it represented that mattered. Control. She had been giving it away for so long, thinking that's what family was supposed to be. But what was the point if no one appreciated it? No one asked. No one cared. It was always assumed she would just fix things. She let out a slow breath and pulled up the option to view James's transactions. The list of recent withdrawals filled the screen, and her stomach tightened as she scanned them. There were large amounts, random businesses, and services she didn't recognize. Each one felt like another mark against her, another betrayal. How long had he been taking advantage? Her mind reeled as she considered her options. She could take action. She could cut him off completely. She could stop the financial drip, the steady bleed of her resources, and see how he handled it on his own. What would happen if she just stopped giving him access? Maggie stared at the button that would freeze his account, her finger hovering over it. Her heart raced, her pulse quickening as she imagined the chaos that would follow. James would be furious. He'd be desperate. He'd accuse her of being vindictive, of ruining everything. But Maggie didn't care anymore. She was angry. She deserved to be angry. The years of unappreciated effort, the years of pouring her life into their family. She wasn't going to let that be erased in an instant. Her finger moved, hovering again just above the button. The idea of taking control over her life, of stopping him from draining what little she had left, was liberating. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the power she had given away, the control she'd relinquished, without even realizing it. She had let James, and by extension, her entire family, dictate the terms of her existence. And now, she was taking that control back. Enough. The word was loud in her mind, a simple declaration that sounded like freedom. She wasn't going to let this happen again. James would never treat her like this again. Not now. Not ever. With a steadying breath, Maggie clicked the button. It wasn't the first step toward revenge. It was the first step toward reclaiming her life, her dignity, her strength. The confirmation page popped up, asking if she was sure. Maggie hesitated for a second, her finger hovering over the confirmation button, but only for a second. She clicked it. The screen flashed with a message that her son's account had been frozen, and for the first time in a long time, Maggie felt a strange peace settle over her. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing. She had taken control. Her fingers trembled again, but this time it wasn't with doubt. It was with the satisfaction of having done something for herself. Something she hadn't done in years. She was no longer invisible. But as the weight of her decision settled in, a new thought crept into her mind. James wouldn't take this lying down, and Maggie knew the storm was coming. But this time, she'd be ready. The office of Eric Sanders, a sleek and modern space lined with dark wood and glass, felt like a sanctuary to Maggie. It was a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. She stood at the window for a moment, staring out at the city below, the skyline lit with the remnants of a fading afternoon. The weight of the decision she'd made earlier still lingered, but now it was time to solidify her course. "Ms. Thompson, it's good to see you." Eric's voice broke through her thoughts as he rose from his desk, extending a hand with a warm, professional smile. He was a man in his 40s, confident, with a hint of compassion beneath his polished demeanor. Maggie had worked with him for years. He had been the one who helped her navigate her late husband's estate, the one who had ensured she was protected during a time when everything felt uncertain. Now he was going to help her reclaim what was rightfully hers. "Thank you, Eric," she replied, her voice steady despite the nerves twisting in her gut. She shook his hand, then took a seat across from him. The air between them felt different today. There was an unspoken understanding that had shifted since their last meeting. Maggie wasn't here to deal with an estate or a simple legal matter. She was here to regain control over her life. Eric settled into his chair, clicking a few keys on his laptop before looking back at her. "I've looked over your case, but I'd like to hear it from you. What's been happening?" Maggie exhaled slowly, the words forming in her mind but still feeling too heavy to say aloud. She cleared her throat, gathering her thoughts. "It's my son, James. I've been supporting him for years, financially, emotionally, and now I'm realizing it's never been enough. He's been dismissive, entitled, and frankly, disrespectful. After everything I've done for him, he told me I was a burden." The words felt foreign, like they were coming from someone else. Eric's eyes softened, but there was a professional distance in his gaze. He had seen this before: families in conflict, assets being used as leverage, and people who had been pushed to their limits. "That's a lot to process, Maggie. I'm sorry you're going through this." Maggie nodded, her gaze steady. "I've always done everything for them, for him. I never asked for anything, but now I'm tired of being treated like I'm invisible, like I'm just here to fix everything and clean up the messes." She leaned forward, the fire that had been simmering inside her now starting to burn brightly. "I froze his account," she said, her voice low but firm. "I want to know if I'm doing the right thing, if I'm legally protected." Eric didn't flinch. He simply nodded, his fingers tapping the desk lightly as he processed her words. "You've done the right thing. Legally, you're well within your rights to freeze an account linked to yours if you're being taken advantage of, but there are steps you'll need to take to ensure this is handled properly." Maggie listened intently, her heart beating a little faster as Eric continued. "If James is acting irresponsibly with the assets you've shared, you have the right to protect yourself. This means cutting him off from any access to your accounts, and I can help you ensure that's done legally. But I also want to stress something, Maggie," Eric said, looking at her with a more serious expression. "This is just the beginning. It's important to understand the ramifications of what you're doing. Freezing his access is one thing, but if he takes legal action, if he claims you're being vindictive or controlling, that could lead to complications." Maggie's mind raced. She had considered all the potential fallout, but hearing Eric put it into words made it all feel more real, more daunting. But she wasn't backing down now. She couldn't. "I've been controlled by him for too long," Maggie said, her voice tinged with both resolve and the quiet pain of finally confronting the reality of her situation. "I've been invisible for too long. I need to do this. For myself." Eric studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "You're not alone in this. You're doing what's necessary to protect yourself. I'm here to help you through every step." Maggie nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle inside her. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishing James. This was about reclaiming her dignity, her peace of mind, and most importantly, her control. Eric stood, moving to a filing cabinet and pulling out a few documents. "I've already drafted the necessary paperwork. If you're ready, we can start the process today. You can sign, and we'll move forward with the legal steps to ensure James is no longer a part of your financial decisions." Maggie took a deep breath. This was it. This was her moment. She reached for the pen, her fingers trembling slightly, not with fear, but with the weight of what she was about to do. With a steady hand, she signed the documents. The sound of the pen against the paper felt like a release, like a door closing on a chapter that had held her hostage for far too long. Eric looked up as she signed the last line, offering her a reassuring smile. "You've made a strong decision today, Maggie. This is just the first step." Maggie stood, her legs feeling a little weaker than they had before. But inside, she felt something different. Empowered. For the first time in a long time, she had done something for herself. And no matter what happened next, no matter how hard James fought back, she knew she had taken control of her life again. As she left the office, the weight on her shoulders felt lighter. But the storm, she knew, was still coming. And for the first time, she wasn't running from it. She was ready to face it head-on. Maggie walked into her living room, the familiar scent of lavender and lemon wafting through the air as she passed the floral curtains that Thomas had picked out years ago. The house felt quieter now, emptier. She had expected the stillness, but it was somehow heavier than she'd anticipated. The weight of the decision she'd made today pressed on her chest like a constant reminder. She went to her desk, the one by the window that overlooked the quiet street, and sat down. The screen of her laptop blinked to life, casting its cold light onto the dark wood of the desk. She stared at the digital banking page, the numbers on the screen feeling more real now than they ever had before. James's account was still linked to hers, an open door she could choose to close. Maggie's fingers hovered above the keys, each movement deliberate but weighted with the gravity of her actions. Her heartbeat thrummed in her chest as her hand hovered over the freeze button. There was a momentary hesitation, a fraction of a second where she thought about the consequences. What would James say? Would he come storming to the house? Would he lash out? Would he accuse her of being cruel? Of betraying him? But that hesitation didn't last. She had been giving for so long, her entire life revolving around taking care of others, and it had led her to this point, a mother who was taken for granted, a woman who had disappeared into the roles of caretaker and enabler. Not anymore. She clicked the button. The page refreshed, confirming her action. James Thompson's account has been frozen. Maggie exhaled slowly, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, her hand trembled slightly against the edge of the desk, the quiet hum of the computer filling the silence in the room. It wasn't fear. It was something else. A surge of power, a heady rush of taking control of her own life. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers now resting loosely on the desk, as she let the weight of the decision settle in her chest. The relief was instant, but it was more than that. It was an overwhelming sense of accomplishment, a quiet victory that had been years in the making. This wasn't just about money. It was about independence. It was about the quiet surrender she had lived in for so long. The giving, the sacrifices, the endless balancing act of caring for everyone else while she faded into the background. For the first time, she wasn't invisible. Maggie thought about her late husband, Thomas. He would have understood. He would have supported her in this decision. He would have been proud. She hadn't wanted to come to this, to sever ties with James, but the betrayal, the dismissiveness, had left her with no other choice. She wondered how James would react. Anger? Desperation? He would be furious. That much was certain. He'd probably try to manipulate her, guilt her into thinking she was being unreasonable. But Maggie wasn't worried anymore. She'd made this decision for herself, and for the first time in years, it wasn't about him. The phone on the desk buzzed, jarring her from her thoughts. She glanced at it, half expecting to see a message from James, demanding answers, accusing her of betrayal. Instead, it was a reminder about a meeting she had scheduled with Lily later in the evening. She hadn't spoken to her daughter in a while, not since the confrontation with James. It made her uneasy, the idea of facing her daughter after everything that had transpired. But Maggie knew that rebuilding her life meant mending her relationship with Lily too, not just cutting off the toxic connections. Her phone buzzed again, this time a text from Lily. "Mom, are you okay?" Maggie stared at the screen for a moment, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Should she tell Lily what had happened? Or should she wait for the inevitable confrontation with James first? She wasn't sure. But one thing was certain. She wasn't going to keep running anymore. Maggie set the phone down, her resolve hardening. James would come to her, demanding answers, but she wasn't afraid. She wasn't the woman who had been dismissed and ignored for all those years. She was someone else now, someone stronger. She stood up from the desk and walked to the window, looking out at the street once more. The houses on the block were as still as ever, the trees swaying gently in the wind. The world outside was unchanged. But Maggie, she had changed. She had taken the first step toward rebuilding everything she had given up. Her reflection in the window stared back at her, a woman who was no longer bound by the expectations of others. She had taken control, and as the evening settled in, Maggie couldn't help but wonder just how far this would go, how much further she was willing to push. She had started something now, and she knew there was no turning back. James would find out soon enough, but by then, Maggie would be ready. Maggie's phone buzzed again, slicing through the stillness of the room. She glanced at the screen, her stomach tightening for just a moment before she saw the name that flashed across the top. James. The message was short, demanding. "Why are you being so difficult? What's the deal?" The words were sharp, pointed, so typical of him. His casual dismissal. His complete lack of understanding. Maggie's pulse quickened as she read it, her mind flashing back to every moment when she'd bent to his will, when she'd given and given, only to have him take her for granted. For so long, she'd twisted herself into knots trying to placate him, make him understand, apologize for things she didn't even do. But not today. The guilt, the usual wave of doubt, didn't come. For a split second, Maggie wondered if it ever would again. But the feeling was fleeting. In fact, the more she thought about it, the more she realized how little she cared what James thought of her now. She wasn't the same woman she had been when she first read messages like this. The woman who would have apologized, who would have explained herself, who would have shrunk into the background, trying to fix the mess he created. No. Maggie wasn't that woman anymore. She stared at the screen for a moment, the words burning in her eyes, but no longer with the same sting. She'd been so conditioned to believe that she had to answer him, to resolve his tantrums, to be the one who took responsibility for his mistakes. That was her role, the fixer, the mother who always stepped in. But now she wasn't fixing anything for him. She wasn't saving him anymore. With a deep breath, she set the phone down on the desk. Her fingers lingered on the edge of it, the cool surface grounding her. For the first time in a long while, the weight she'd carried for years felt lighter. The need to respond, to explain, to justify herself was gone. She wasn't trapped in the cycle of his manipulations anymore. She had stepped out of it. Maggie turned the phone off, the screen going black, as though she was shutting out the voice that had dominated her life for so long. Her hand remained on the phone for a moment, as if savoring the feeling of letting go. Not today. Not anymore. She stood up from her desk and walked across the room, her feet moving with a newfound purpose, a lightness that surprised her. She walked to the window, her eyes drifting to the quiet street outside. The world beyond her window was still, unchanged. But inside, everything was different. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into this house earlier. The woman who had been afraid of confrontation, afraid of being alone. Alone. It didn't seem so bad now. Maggie leaned against the windowsill, staring out at the setting sun, the orange light spilling across the rooftops. She thought back to all the times she had made excuses for James. The phone calls when he'd yelled at her, the moments when he'd pulled her into his problems, and she'd blamed herself for not doing enough. The way she'd told herself that one day, he'd see, he'd understand. But now she knew better. The manipulation had been subtle at first. Small things, little jabs, guilt trips disguised as innocent comments. But over the years, it had become so much more. The emotional toll had been silent, gradual, but devastating all the same. Maggie had let it happen. She had allowed herself to be used, because in some twisted way, she believed it was her duty to do so. She was his mother. She was supposed to be the one to fix him. No more. For the first time, Maggie felt the heaviness of the years lift from her shoulders. She felt strong, empowered. This was her moment. And while it was hard, while there was still the voice in her head warning her that this wasn't how a mother should behave, Maggie could silence it now. She had done enough. She had done more than enough. Her thoughts shifted to Lily. She knew that she would have to face her daughter soon, but the fear that had once gripped her in those moments of confrontation was no longer there. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had no more apologies to make for herself. No more shouldering guilt for things that weren't hers to carry. The silence of the house was both peaceful and deafening. It was the calm before the storm. Maggie knew that once James found out what she had done, there would be a fight. There would be anger and bitterness and resentment. But she wouldn't back down. She couldn't. She had made this choice for herself. And it was the first of many steps in taking back control of her life. The phone buzzed again. Maggie turned to look at it, but she didn't reach for it. She didn't need to. She knew what it would say. Instead, she turned away, walking out of the room and down the hallway. Each step felt like a small victory, a reclaiming of everything she had once lost. As she reached the door, she glanced back toward the phone on the desk. The buzz of another message would come again, but for now, she was ready to let it go. The storm was coming, but Maggie was finally prepared to face it. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, but Maggie didn't mind. The silence wasn't the same as it had been a few days ago. Back then, it had felt oppressive, like it was closing in on her. Today, it felt like a space she could finally breathe in, a space she had created for herself. The morning sun filtered softly through the living room curtains, casting golden light across the hardwood floor. Maggie was sitting on the couch, a cup of tea cradled in her hands, the warmth of it seeping through her fingers. She hadn't had a moment like this in years. Just sitting, doing nothing, with no one else's demands weighing her down. The thought was almost foreign to her. But as she took a sip, feeling the warmth travel through her, she realized something. This was peace. She had spent so many years living in the background, pouring herself into everyone else's needs. James needs this, Lily needs that, the house needs attention, the bills need paying. It had always been about what others needed, what was expected of her. And somewhere along the way, Maggie had lost herself. She had become a shadow of the woman she used to be, a woman who had once dreamed of more than just taking care of people, more than just surviving. Now, the dream was hers again. She looked around the room, her eyes landing on the small bookshelf in the corner. Dust settled on the books she had once read with such enthusiasm, the pages now yellowing and forgotten. There was a time when she had lost herself in novels, in poetry, in the simple joy of reading. She hadn't touched a book in years, not since the weight of family obligations had piled on top of her. Maggie stood up and walked over to the shelf, her fingers grazing the spines of the books. She pulled one down, Pride and Prejudice, the very first book she had ever read, cover to cover. She remembered how, as a young woman, she had felt a certain kinship with Elizabeth Bennet, her independent spirit, her refusal to settle for anything less than what she deserved. Maggie sat back down with the book in her hands, flipping it open. The scent of the old pages filled the air, and for a moment, she let herself be swept away by the memories of her younger self, the woman who had once had big dreams, who had once imagined a future that wasn't solely about taking care of others. She smiled softly, the weight of the years lifting from her shoulders with each page. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed this, how much she'd missed her. As the morning passed into afternoon, Maggie found herself drifting between old hobbies and new realizations. She dusted off the guitar that had once sat by the fireplace, a gift from Thomas that she hadn't played in years. She ran her fingers over the strings, strumming a chord that sounded shaky at first, but then began to come alive again as her hands remembered the familiar motions. Music had always been a part of her life, something she had loved, but it had fallen away as responsibilities took over. But now, there was no rush. There was no one waiting for her to fix something. No one demanding her time. The music, the books, the quiet. This was hers. And for the first time in a long time, it felt good to just be. Maggie thought about all the things she had given up over the years, her dreams, her sense of self, her passions. She had sacrificed them, one by one, without even realizing it. Every time she had put someone else's needs before her own, every time she had let her desires slip away to make room for someone else's expectations, she had slowly eroded a part of herself. But now, she was taking it back. Little by little, day by day. The guilt, the feeling that she had to make everything right for everyone else, had been so ingrained in her for so long. It was like a tight knot in her chest that she had carried around for years. But now, with each passing moment, that knot was loosening. She was starting to feel free. Maggie sat back down with her cup of tea, letting the warmth spread through her. She thought about what she wanted to do next. She could travel, see the places she'd always dreamed of visiting. She could write. There were stories in her. Stories she'd never told anyone. Stories that had been tucked away like the dusty books on her shelf. There was so much more she could do. So much more she could be. It felt like the door to a new chapter had just opened. She could walk through it, finally free from the weight of guilt and responsibility she had carried for so long. She could live for herself now. For the first time in years, Maggie didn't feel like she had to apologize for wanting to live for herself. She didn't feel like she had to justify her choices, her time, her happiness. She had earned this. She deserved this. She took another sip of her tea, savoring the quiet, the peace, the freedom. She wasn't running from anything anymore. She wasn't hiding behind the needs of others. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was living on her own terms. And as the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, Maggie felt a sense of hope stir deep inside her, a hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. The storm had come and gone, and she had weathered it. Now, the calm was hers to enjoy. Her life was hers again, and nothing could take that away. Maggie sat in the dim light of the living room, her laptop open in front of her. The morning's peaceful tranquility was fading, replaced by a quiet but growing storm inside her. She had always trusted James, believed that the money she'd lent him, the cash she'd helped him manage, was all part of the family effort to keep things going. But something had shifted. The more she thought about the conversations they'd had, the more she realized how much she had overlooked, how much he had hidden from her. It wasn't just the reckless spending, or the constant requests for more money. No, it was something deeper, something far more deceptive. Maggie had noticed the small signs over the past few months, the discrepancies in his explanations, the odd little comments that never quite added up. So, she'd decided to do something she hadn't done in years. She'd gone through his financial records, digging through the accounts she'd allowed him to access. Her eyes scanned the screen as she reviewed the transactions. At first, there were the familiar purchases, car repairs, utility bills, even a few business-related expenses, but then her gaze froze on one entry, then another. Large transfers. To accounts she didn't recognize. Personal accounts that were tied to his name, but that she'd never known about. Maggie clicked on the links, the figures and dates blurring together until it hit her like a punch to the gut. James had been hiding money from her. Money he had secretly stashed away. Money he hadn't even mentioned in their countless conversations about his business or his supposed financial struggles. She felt the cold rush of betrayal in her chest, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the tea she had been drinking just an hour ago. James had lied to her. He had used her. A part of her wanted to call him immediately, to demand an explanation, but she couldn't. Not this time. Maggie closed the laptop slowly, the weight of the truth settling deep in her bones. She had been enabling him all these years, helping him believe his lies, and now it was clear that the person who needed help was her, not him. The doorbell rang, breaking through the tension. Maggie stood, her heart pounding as she walked toward the front door. She didn't need to ask who it was. She had known this moment was coming. As she opened the door, James stood there, a faint smirk on his face, his eyes cold and calculating. "Maggie," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I need to talk to you." Maggie stood firm, her posture straight, her mind already bracing for the confrontation she knew was inevitable. "About what?" she asked, her voice calm but with an edge that James didn't seem to notice. "About the mess you've made," James muttered, brushing past her. He dropped his jacket on the couch, oblivious to the icy silence that surrounded them. "You froze my account, and you know that's not going to work. I need access to those funds. You know you can't just cut me off like this. It's ridiculous." Maggie closed the door behind him, her eyes locking onto his with a newfound intensity. "No, James," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "It's not ridiculous. What's ridiculous is how you've been lying to me for years." James raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. "Lying to you? What the hell are you talking about?" Maggie stepped forward, the truth burning inside her. She didn't flinch. She didn't back down. "The money. The accounts you've been hiding. The transfers. The ones you never told me about." Her words were sharp, precise, and each one felt like a victory. "You've been lying to me, James, and I've been enabling you. I've been cleaning up your messes for too long." James froze, his expression shifting. He opened his mouth, but no words came out at first. When he finally spoke, his voice was defensive, almost panicked. You don't understand, Mom. You don't get it. This is about business. This is how things work." He waved his hand dismissively, as if brushing her concerns aside. "You're overreacting." Maggie's heart thudded in her chest, but she stood taller. "No, you're overreacting," she replied, her voice cutting through his excuses. "This is the last time I clean up your mess. You've been using me, James, for years. I've been trying to help you, but this isn't about helping anymore. This is about control. And I'm done letting you control me." James's face reddened, his anger simmering just below the surface. "You're being unreasonable. I'm your son. You're supposed to help me." His voice cracked slightly as he took a step toward her. "I'm struggling. You don't get it." Maggie didn't move. She met his eyes with a calmness that shocked her. "I've been helping you your whole life, but now I'm helping myself. I've been invisible for too long. It's time for you to deal with the consequences of your own actions. And I won't be your scapegoat anymore." James stepped back, his face twisted in frustration, and for a moment Maggie saw the desperation in his eyes. But she didn't feel the usual pang of guilt. She didn't rush to apologize, to soften her words. She was done with that. "This is how it ends, James," she said quietly, her voice firm. "You're on your own now. I'm done enabling you." James opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, he turned abruptly, storming out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Maggie didn't move. She didn't chase after him. She just stood there, the weight of the confrontation sinking in. The relief was immediate. The knot she hadn't realized was there unraveled in that moment. For the first time, she wasn't held captive by his manipulation. For the first time, she had taken control. Maggie sank into the couch, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't feel fear. She didn't feel regret. She felt something else. Something powerful. She felt free. The phone rang, its sharp sound breaking the silence that had settled over the house like a blanket. Maggie's hand froze in midair as she picked it up from the kitchen counter, her heart beating in her chest. The call was from the bank. She had been expecting this, but now that it was happening, the weight of it felt heavier than she imagined. Taking a deep breath, Maggie answered, her voice steady. "Hello? Good afternoon, Ms. Thompson." A calm, professional voice greeted her. "I'm calling to confirm that the freeze on your son's account has been processed successfully. All access has been restricted." Maggie's pulse quickened, but she didn't let it show. She had done it. It had worked. The relief washed over her like a wave, but it wasn't just relief. It was something deeper. It was power. It was control. For the first time in years, she felt as though she was standing on her own 2 feet, unburdened by the weight of expectations or manipulation. "Thank you," Maggie said, her voice almost a whisper. "Thank you for handling it so quickly." The call ended with polite pleasantries, but Maggie didn't hear the last few words. She was still suspended in the moment, her thoughts swirling as the truth of what she had done fully sank in. She had taken the reins of her life again. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. She placed the phone down on the kitchen counter with deliberate care, as if setting it down meant something. It meant that she had control. It meant that this was her life now. Maggie stood there for a moment, her eyes drifting across the room. The kitchen felt different somehow. Lighter. As if it had been waiting for this moment. The house, which had once felt like a prison, was now the backdrop to her new reality. She was no longer defined by the demands of others. She remembered how, just a few days ago, she had been overwhelmed by the constant pull of obligations. Every phone call from James had been a reminder of how much she had given up for him, for Lily, for Thomas, for the family. But today, the world felt open, almost infinite, in a way it hadn't in years. Maggie sank into a chair at the kitchen table, her mind still racing. She thought back on the years she had spent serving everyone else's needs, her time swallowed up by their problems, her desires left by the wayside. She had been the provider, the caretaker, the one everyone could count on. But in doing so, she had erased herself. She had hidden her own dreams beneath their demands. No more. The realization hit her like a gentle wave, building slowly but unmistakably. She was capable of so much more. She wasn't weak. She wasn't helpless. She had spent so many years doubting her own worth, allowing others to dictate her value. But now she understood that she was just as deserving of happiness and success as anyone else. For the first time in years, she wasn't weighed down by guilt. She had given enough. She had done more than enough. Now, it was time to live for herself. Maggie glanced out the window at the quiet suburban street. The trees gently swayed in the breeze, the sun setting behind the horizon. The world was still the same, but she was different. She had crossed an invisible threshold, a line she'd never thought she'd be able to cross. As she sat there, a quiet thrill began to stir inside her. What would she do next? For so long, her life had been a series of responsibilities, obligations, and sacrifices. But now she could choose her path. She could do anything. The possibilities stretched out before her like a blank canvas. Travel. Write. Maybe start her own business. There was a part of her that had always longed to do something creative. Something just for herself. Why not now? Maggie's lips curved into a small smile as she sat back in the chair, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of the table. The thought of what she could accomplish, of what she could create, filled her with an excitement she hadn't felt in ages. She was free. For so long she had been caught in a cycle of duty and guilt, but now she was in the driver's seat of her own life. She wasn't bound by anyone else's expectations or limitations. She wasn't going to be someone's safety net anymore. She took a deep breath and stood, her feet moving with purpose as she walked over to the counter. Maggie poured herself another cup of tea, the warmth of it grounding her. But there was something else there too. A fire, a hunger for more. She could do this. She would do this. As she sipped the tea, Maggie felt an overwhelming sense of triumph. It wasn't just about the money or the account she had frozen. It was about taking control of her own life, about standing up for herself, about being the woman she had always been, strong, capable, and worthy of everything she had ever dreamed of. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the future wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. The phone buzzed again, interrupting her thoughts. Maggie picked it up with a steady hand, her smile growing as she saw the name on the screen. She wasn't worried anymore. She wasn't running. She was ready to face whatever came next. For the first time in years, she was living for herself. Maggie sat at her desk, the soft light of the desk lamp illuminating the stack of papers in front of her. Her laptop was open and the words, "business plan," typed into the search bar. She had been researching for hours, reading articles, taking notes, and watching videos on how to start a small business. At first, she had felt overwhelmed by the idea, unsure of where to begin. But now, a sense of excitement began to pulse through her, quickening her pulse as she thought about the possibility. This is it, she thought, tapping the pen on the edge of the desk. This is what I've been waiting for. She had never considered herself an entrepreneur. Her life had always been about doing what needed to be done, caring for her family, managing her finances, solving problems. But now, as she stared at the screen, looking at the possibilities laid out before her, she realized she was more than capable of starting something new. Maggie had always loved the idea of working for herself. She dreamed of starting a business years ago, but the demands of raising a family, managing the house, and supporting James had pushed those dreams aside. But now, her life was her own, and for the first time, she didn't feel the weight of everyone else's expectations. Her hands flew over the keyboard as she typed, scribbling down ideas, pulling together plans for a business that would combine her skills and passions. The plan began to take shape. A small consultancy focused on helping other small businesses with their finances, budgeting, and growth. It felt like a natural fit. She had always been the one everyone turned to when they needed help managing their money. It was time for her to use that knowledge for herself, to build something that was entirely hers. The hours flew by as Maggie mapped out her strategy. She made lists of potential clients, researched her competitors, and even thought about the branding. What would her business look like? What would it stand for? She wanted it to be professional but approachable, grounded in her years of experience, but fresh and innovative. With every passing minute, the sense of purpose inside her grew. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. The more she planned, the more confident she became in her ability to make this happen. She wasn't relying on anyone else. She wasn't waiting for approval. This was her dream, and she was the one who was going to make it real. As the evening wore on, Maggie reached out to a few potential clients, crafting emails that felt surprisingly natural, asking if they'd be interested in discussing ways she could help them streamline their financial operations. She felt a buzz of excitement each time she hit send. It wasn't just about the work. It was about taking control, about standing on her own 2 feet and making her own path forward. Maggie worked well into the night, refining the details, double-checking the numbers, making sure everything was lined up. There was something invigorating about the process, the sense that each step she took was one closer to the life she'd always wanted, a life that was hers, and hers alone. For years, she had been invisible. Her role had been to help everyone else. But now she was building something for herself, something that would allow her to stand tall, to be seen, and most importantly, to be proud of the work she was doing. Maggie leaned back in her chair, her fingers still resting lightly on the keyboard. The excitement was palpable, the thrill of creating something new, something entirely her own. She felt a rush of energy, the kind of feeling she hadn't had in years. It was freedom, and it was beautiful. She picked up her cup of tea, now cold, and took a sip. The taste was bitter, but the feeling it gave her wasn't. There was something refreshing in the bitter cold of her tea, something that felt right. This was the first time in years that she felt like she had the power to change the course of her life, not just for herself, but for her future. Maggie smiled to herself as she closed her laptop, satisfied with the progress she'd made. She was taking control of her destiny. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was finally living. As she stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street below, the future seemed wide open. The world was full of possibilities, places to visit, people to meet, stories to tell. She was no longer trapped in a world that revolved around everyone else. The phone buzzed again, the sudden interruption pulling Maggie from her thoughts. She glanced at it, her heart skipping a beat. She had grown used to ignoring James's calls, but something about this one made her pause. She picked up the phone, and a brief flicker of doubt flashed in her mind. But then she remembered what she'd just spent the day creating. She wasn't backing down now. Maggie answered the call, her voice calm but firm. "Hello?" On the other end, the voice was familiar, but the words were different. "Mom, we need to talk." And for the first time in a long time, Maggie didn't feel that familiar knot of dread. She was in control now. The days following her conversation with James felt like a turning point for Maggie. The weight that had once pressed down on her, the constant demands, the guilt, the expectation to always fix everything, had finally lifted. But it wasn't just a sense of relief that washed over her. It was a quiet but growing sense of satisfaction. For the first time, she wasn't the one picking up the pieces. The life she had so long devoted herself to was beginning to unravel in ways she hadn't expected. Maggie observed the changes from a distance. She had stopped checking in on James, stopped answering his calls. She no longer needed to know every detail of his business, every financial hiccup he encountered. But from what she could gather through the occasional mutual contact or snippets of conversation with Lily, things weren't going well. James's business, the one he'd insisted was just one big step away from success, was faltering without the financial cushion she'd provided. The loans he'd taken from her, the emergency bailouts, the cash flow that had seemed endless, it was all gone. She felt a flicker of something inside her. It wasn't satisfaction at his failure, not really. No, it was something else. A recognition that, for the first time, James was finally being forced to face the consequences of his own actions. Maggie had always cleaned up after him, always carried the weight of his irresponsibility. Now, he was out of his depth. And for once, it wasn't her job to dive in and save him. The sense of finality that accompanied this realization was strange. It was a mix of bitterness and clarity. They had all taken her for granted. She had given, and given, and given, and all she had gotten in return was disrespect, selfishness, and abandonment. But now, they would see the fallout. A few days later, Maggie received a text from Helen, James's estranged wife. Her heart sank as she read the message, which was short but dripping with accusation. "You did this. You've ruined everything. James can't keep up without you. Now look where we are." The words stung, but not in the way they once might have. Maggie could feel the old pull, the desire to explain, to apologize, to make things right. But that was no longer her burden to carry. She had spent years trying to fix things, trying to patch the holes in a boat that was sinking with every attempt. It wasn't her fault. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she sat down at her desk, staring at the phone. Part of her wanted to call Helen back, to argue, to explain that this wasn't about blame. It was about boundaries. But Maggie knew better now. She had drawn the line. She wasn't going to take on their guilt anymore. They had to find their own way. With a steady hand, Maggie picked up her phone and deleted the message. She wouldn't engage. Not this time. She had already made her decision. The world outside her window looked the same, but it wasn't. She wasn't tied to the messes of her family anymore. No longer was she the person everyone turned to when things fell apart. She had moved on, and she was building something new. She was focused on herself now, on her new business, on her own goals. And though James and Helen's downfall still loomed over them, Maggie couldn't let herself be dragged into their chaos again. She had given them everything. But now it was time to step into her own life, her own future, and leave the past behind. The days slipped into weeks, and Maggie's business began to take shape. She worked tirelessly, setting up the necessary paperwork, building her website, networking with potential clients. The excitement of it all, the idea of working for herself, creating something from the ground up, kept her energized. It was a far cry from the life she had once known, and she wasn't going to let anything pull her back. But even as she moved forward, a part of her couldn't help but think about what was happening to James. He wasn't doing well. That much was clear. His pride, his arrogance, and his entitlement had all but destroyed his marriage and his business. Maggie couldn't help but feel a small flicker of vindication. They had taken her for granted, and now they were paying the price. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she was done being part of their downfall. She couldn't fix them. She had to focus on fixing herself. She had to let them face their consequences, just as she was facing hers. The truth was, Maggie didn't need them anymore. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need their thanks. She was thriving in a way she had never imagined. The future, once clouded by the weight of obligation and self-doubt, was now clear. For the first time, Maggie was the one in control. And as the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, casting a warm, golden light across her kitchen, Maggie smiled to herself. The world was full of possibilities, and she was ready to embrace every single one. She didn't have to save anyone anymore. She had already saved herself. Maggie sat at her desk, staring at the latest email in her inbox, her heart skipping a beat. It was from one of her first clients. She had only launched her business a few months ago, unsure of what to expect. But this email felt like confirmation that everything she had worked for was finally paying off. Dear Maggie, we wanted to thank you for your work with our finances over the past few weeks. We've already started seeing improvements in our cash flow, and your insights were invaluable. We look forward to continuing our partnership and would highly recommend your services to anyone in need of financial guidance. Maggie read the email again, a wide grin spreading across her face. She had done it. She had truly done it. She had built something from nothing, and now it was flourishing. The excitement that had been simmering beneath her calm exterior for months finally burst to the surface. Her heart raced as she leaned back in her chair, breathing deeply. This was her dream coming true, right before her eyes. She glanced around her small office, still with the same cozy, cluttered feel she had started with, but everything now felt different. The stack of business cards she had printed on a whim were almost gone. Her website had gained more traffic than she ever thought possible, and the network she had carefully built over the past few weeks was growing steadily. The thrill of success was not just in the financial growth, it was in the feeling that she had taken control. She had stood at the edge of her life, uncertain and scared, and yet here she was, standing taller than she ever had before. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't even about the work, though she loved what she was doing. It was about the independence, the autonomy, the power to decide how her days would unfold. And now, the rewards were beginning to come in. As Maggie continued to review her inbox, she saw more positive responses, more clients asking for her help. She had not only built a business, but a reputation. People were starting to take her seriously. She was becoming known for her straightforward approach, her expertise, and her ability to bring clarity to chaotic financial situations. It felt like the recognition she had never received in her personal life. Finally, people saw her value. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the world outside. The neighborhood was as quiet as ever, the same trees lining the street, the same neighbors walking their dogs. But Maggie was different. She had changed. She was no longer the woman who had spent her life giving everything for others, watching as they took her for granted. No, now she was the woman who built something all on her own, and that made all the difference. She reached for her phone, checking the notifications, and there it was. A message from a new potential client. Maggie's pulse quickened as she opened it. "I've heard great things about your work. Would love to schedule a consultation for next week." Her mind raced. She hadn't even finished the first month before people started referring her. She had spent so many years letting other people's needs come first that she had never imagined a future where her success, her independence, could be hers alone. But now, as she read that message, she realized that it wasn't just a possibility. It was reality. Maggie quickly typed a response, confirming the meeting. Then she sat back again, her thoughts moving in a whirlwind. This was it. She had started from scratch. She had been afraid, but now that fear felt so far away, like a distant memory, she was thriving, not just surviving. The phone rang then, and Maggie's hand shot out to answer it, her mind still buzzing with excitement. It was another client, someone she had met through a networking event just a few weeks ago. "Hello, Maggie," the voice on the other end said. "I just wanted to say thank you again for your consultation. You've helped us streamline our finances, and we're already seeing results. I can't tell you how much of a difference you've made." Maggie smiled. It felt like the universe had opened up, rewarding her for every sleepless night, every hour spent reading and researching, every moment she had doubted herself and pushed forward anyway. "Thank you. It's been a pleasure working with you. I'm so glad to hear everything is improving." The conversation was brief but full of affirmation. Another success under her belt. After hanging up, Maggie sat there, still processing the growth, the progress, the hours of research, the careful networking, the late nights spent building the foundation of her business. They were all paying off. Maggie's phone buzzed again, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was Lily. "Mom, I heard you got a new client today. That's amazing. I'm so proud of you." Maggie's heart warmed at the words. She hadn't expected Lily to understand, not fully, but her daughter was proud, and that was enough. "Thank you, sweetheart," Maggie replied, smiling. "I'm proud of me too." She hung up the phone, standing there for a moment, taking it all in. This was just the beginning, and Maggie knew she was on the verge of something even bigger. The road ahead was wide open, full of new possibilities, new challenges, and new triumphs. She walked back to her desk, her fingers dancing over the keyboard as she continued refining her plans for the future. It was all coming together, faster than she had ever imagined, And for the first time in a long time, Maggie truly felt like she was on the path she was meant to walk. Not the path others had set for her, but her own. This was the life she had created, and no one could take it away from her. Maggie sat in her cozy living room, the soft hum of the air conditioning filling the silence. It had been a few weeks since the business had truly started taking off, and the weight of her new life was beginning to feel like home. She had spent the past few months absorbed in building her future, but there was one piece of her life that she hadn't fully embraced: the relationship with Sophie, her daughter. For so long, Sophie had been distant, hurt by the changes in Maggie's life, unsure of how to navigate the shifting tides between them. Their conversations had become more sparse, their interactions fleeting. Maggie had been so focused on surviving, on building her own independence, that she hadn't seen how far apart they had drifted. But now, as she stood on the other side of that long journey, Maggie realized that it was time to repair the damage. Her phone buzzed, a text from Sophie lighting up the screen. "Can we talk? I'd like to see you." Maggie's heart did a little flip. She hadn't heard from Sophie in weeks. The air between them had been thick with unspoken words, things left unsaid, but now it seemed Sophie was reaching out. Maggie quickly typed a response. "Of course. When?" Sophie's reply came almost immediately. "How about this afternoon?" Maggie's stomach fluttered as she set her phone down, her mind racing. This was the moment. She had built a business, reclaimed her life, and now it was time to rebuild her relationship with the one person who meant more than anything else. She wasn't sure what Sophie wanted to talk about, but she knew this was a chance for them to start fresh, to reconnect, and most importantly, to heal. A few hours later, Sophie arrived at the door, her presence instantly bringing a sense of warmth to the room. She was dressed casually, her long hair pulled into a loose ponytail, and for a moment, Maggie felt like no time had passed at all. The familiar look in Sophie's eyes, a mix of vulnerability and strength, was still there. "Hey, Mom," Sophie said quietly, a hesitant smile tugging at her lips. "Hey, sweetheart," Maggie replied, her voice thick with emotion. She stepped forward, giving Sophie a warm hug, and the years of tension seemed to melt away in that moment. It was a simple gesture, but it carried so much weight. They pulled apart, and Maggie gestured for Sophie to sit on the couch. The moment felt like a long time coming, but they both knew it wasn't going to be easy. Sophie settled into the couch, her hands folded in her lap. There was a long pause, as if both of them were waiting for the other to say something first. Maggie broke the silence, her voice soft but steady. "I know things have been hard between us. I've been focused on building my own life, but I've missed you. I want to make things right between us." Sophie met her gaze, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and understanding. "I've missed you too, Mom. I guess. I just didn't know how to deal with the changes. It felt like you were pulling away from me, and I didn't know how to handle that." Maggie's heart ached at her daughter's words. She had been so consumed with her own journey that she hadn't fully realized the toll it had taken on Sophie. The distance that had grown between them was not just about Maggie's transformation, it was also about how Sophie had struggled to find her place in that new world. "I never meant to pull away from you," Maggie said softly, her voice breaking a little. "I've been so focused on getting my own life together that I forgot to check in with you, to see how you were doing. I was so wrapped up in trying to fix everything that I didn't realize I was making things worse." Sophie's expression softened. "I get it, Mom. I know you were just trying to take care of things, but it felt like you didn't need me anymore, like I wasn't part of your life the way I used to be." Maggie's chest tightened. "I do need you, Sophie. I always have. I just got lost in everything else, and I'm sorry for that. I'm not perfect, but I'm trying to be better. For myself, and for us." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their conversation settling between them. Maggie realized that they were both broken in different ways, but they were also both capable of healing. Distance, she had come to understand, could sometimes create the space needed for growth. They had both had time to reflect, to learn, and now it was time to take those lessons and build something stronger. I think, I think I'm ready to try again, Sophie said softly, her voice hesitant but sincere. Maggie nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. Me too, sweetheart. I want us to be okay. They reached for each other's hands, a quiet moment of reconnection that spoke volumes. They didn't need grand gestures or promises. They just needed to be there for each other, to rebuild the trust that had been broken, one step at a time. The conversation shifted then, from old hurts to new beginnings. They talked about their lives, about what they wanted for the future. Sophie shared her plans, her dreams, and Maggie listened, her heart swelling with pride. She had missed so much, but now she was ready to be a part of it all again. As the afternoon wore on, Maggie realized how much she had grown, not just in her business, but in her relationships. She had come a long way, and so had Sophie. They were both on different paths, but they were walking them together now, with understanding and hope. Later that evening, as Maggie sat down to her laptop, responding to new emails and preparing for another busy day ahead, she felt a peace she hadn't known in years. The relationships that had once felt fractured, lost, were starting to heal. And with that, healing came a sense of wholeness she hadn't even realized she was missing. She wasn't just rebuilding her business, she was rebuilding her life, and that, more than anything, was worth celebrating. Maggie smiled to herself as she typed the next message, her fingers flying over the keyboard. Things were changing, but in the best way possible. The future was no longer something to fear, it was something to embrace. Maggie sat at the small cafe table, the warm breeze of the late afternoon brushing against her skin. She had spent the morning wandering through the quaint streets of a city she had never visited before, marveling at the colorful architecture and the vibrant pulse of life. Her suitcase sat at her feet, ready for the next adventure. She had a flight home in the morning, but today was hers. She had earned it. For so long she had been consumed by responsibility, the unyielding need to care for others, to make sure everything ran smoothly. She had been bound by the expectations of her family, her business, her own fears. But now she was free. The business she had painstakingly built from the ground up was thriving. Sophie was back in her life, and their relationship, though still fragile, was being mended with each passing day. The weight of the past was lifting, replaced by something new. Possibility. Maggie stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, a small smile tugging at her lips as she thought about how far she had come. Just a year ago, she would have never imagined herself sitting here, on her own, in a city thousands of miles away from home. The thought of taking a solo trip would have seemed unimaginable, but now, the freedom she had fought so hard to regain felt exhilarating. It was more than just financial independence. It was emotional liberation. She had taken a risk by starting her own business, and now the rewards were beginning to surface in unexpected ways. Her clients were happy, the referrals were rolling in, and she was finding joy in each project she completed. Every success was a testament to her resilience, to the strength she had discovered within herself. She wasn't just building a business, she was building a life, one that was hers and hers alone. Maggie leaned back in her chair, the sun warm on her face, and thought about how much her mindset had shifted over the past few months. She had once viewed herself as someone who had to constantly prove her worth, someone who existed to fix everyone else's problems. Now, she realized that her worth had always been inherent. She wasn't defined by her ability to sacrifice. She was defined by her ability to choose who she gave her time to choose what she wanted her life to look like, to choose her own path. The phone buzzed on the table, and Maggie picked it up. It was a message from one of her new clients. She opened it eagerly. "Hi, Maggie. I wanted to thank you for all your help over the past few months. We're finally seeing the positive impact on our business. Your advice was exactly what we needed. Can't wait to continue working with you." Maggie smiled, her heart swelling with pride. She was good at this. She was building something that mattered, not just for herself, but for others. She was helping people, making a difference. And she didn't need anyone else's approval to validate her worth anymore. She had built this. This success was hers. As the evening approached, Maggie stood up from the table and began walking through the city streets again, feeling the rhythm of the place wrap around her. She had long ago stopped being afraid of the unknown. The more she traveled, the more she realized that there was nothing to fear. Every city was a reflection of her own life, full of unknowns, full of surprises. But each new experience taught her something about herself. Maggie had never taken risks before. She had played it safe, always making sure others were taken care of before pursuing her own dreams. But now she was starting to take those risks. Big ones, small ones. She was embracing uncertainty with open arms, knowing that she had the strength to navigate whatever came her way. She thought back to her first client, the small consultancy she had built from scratch. It felt like a lifetime ago, and in some ways, it was. It felt like the moment she had truly started living. Since then, she had expanded her business, started offering new services, and was even considering bringing on help to manage the growing workload. She was scaling, not just her business, but her life. With each project, with each new client, Maggie's confidence grew. She no longer hesitated when faced with challenges. Where once she would have doubted herself, now she charged forward with a belief that she was capable of anything. Her fear had been replaced with excitement, her hesitation with clarity. She stopped for a moment, looking up at the skyline, the golden hour light casting everything in a warm glow. The city was alive with possibilities, endless, beautiful possibilities. She was part of that. She was creating her own future, and it was more vibrant than she had ever dreamed. Maggie's phone buzzed again, but this time, she didn't look down at it immediately. Instead, she stood there, breathing in the moment, allowing herself to feel the full weight of her freedom. She had come so far, and she was just getting started. The phone buzzed once more, this time more urgent, but Maggie still didn't reach for it. She smiled, knowing that whatever it was, she could handle it. She had faced so much worse in the past, things that once seemed insurmountable. And yet here she was, thriving. The freedom was hers for the taking, and for the first time, Maggie knew that she wasn't going back. Not to the life she had before, not to the woman who had been weighed down by expectations. She was ready for whatever came next, because she was no longer afraid. Her life was hers, and she was never looking back. Maggie stood in front of the large floor-to-ceiling windows of her new office, overlooking the city's skyline. It felt surreal. Just a year ago, she had been sitting at a desk in her small home office, unsure of where her future was headed. Now, she had an entire team working with her, and her consultancy had grown into something much bigger than she ever could have imagined. The business she had started with nothing but a dream was now thriving. Clients from all over the country were reaching out to her for guidance. The foundation she had built was stronger than she ever thought possible. It was no longer just about providing financial advice. It was about creating an empire, a place where others could thrive, a place that reflected her strength and resilience. Maggie turned away from the window and walked across the room, her heels clicking on the polished hardwood floor. Her office was spacious, modern, with a sleek desk in the middle and comfortable chairs for meetings. But what made it truly hers was the energy, the sense of purpose that radiated from every corner of the space. It wasn't just a place of work, it was a reflection of her journey, of everything she had overcome. She sat at her desk and glanced at the photo of Sophie on the corner of the table. Their relationship had grown, deepened over the past year. Sophie had become more than just her daughter. She had become her greatest ally, sharing in her success and understanding the sacrifices it had taken to get here. They were building their own legacy together. Maggie smiled to herself. Legacy. It was a word that had never meant much to her until now. But as her business expanded, she realized that what she was creating wasn't just for her. It was for every woman who had ever felt invisible. Every woman who had ever been told she wasn't enough. She was creating something that would outlast her, something that would inspire and empower others long after she was gone. The door to her office creaked open, and Rachel, one of her trusted team members, stepped inside. "Maggie, the presentation for the new client is ready," she said, holding a tablet in her hand. "Great. Let's take a look," Maggie replied, her voice steady but brimming with excitement. She had been waiting for this moment. This was the type of client she had once only dreamed of working with. A major company, one that had long been on her radar, had reached out to her for a partnership. This was the next big step in expanding her reach, solidifying her place in the industry. As Maggie reviewed the presentation with Rachel, her mind raced with possibilities. They were on the verge of something huge, and she wasn't going to let anything or anyone stop her. She'd spent years being overlooked, undervalued, but now she was the one calling the shots. Rachel noticed Maggie's thoughtful expression. "Everything okay?" she asked. Maggie looked up from the tablet, a sense of pride swelling inside her. "Everything's more than okay," she said with a smile. "We're doing exactly what I've always wanted. This business is mine, and it's just the beginning." A few months later, Maggie found herself speaking at a women's entrepreneurship event, a platform she would have once thought was too far out of reach. As she took the stage, she looked out at the crowd, a sea of faces that had once felt so foreign to her. But now, standing before them, Maggie felt nothing but strength. She had built this platform, not just for herself, but for others. Her success had become a beacon for other women to follow, a testament to what could be achieved when you refused to accept limitations. "Thank you for having me here today," Maggie said into the microphone, her voice steady. "When I started my business, I was told it wasn't possible, that it wasn't the right time, that I wasn't the right person. But here's the truth. There's never a perfect time. There's just your time. And the time to start is always now." The crowd erupted into applause, and for the first time, Maggie felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. She wasn't just leading her business, she was leading a movement. As her speech ended and she stepped off the stage, Maggie was surrounded by women who had come to speak with her, to ask for advice, to share their own stories. It was overwhelming, humbling, but also incredibly fulfilling. She had once been the woman who was afraid to ask for help, too scared to make the leap. But now, she was the one helping others find their way. Later that evening, as Maggie sat in her office once more, a quiet sense of contentment washed over her. She reflected on how much she had achieved. Her business had grown into something substantial, and the connections she had made over the years were now turning into lasting partnerships. She had hired a team of women who shared her vision, who were just as passionate about empowering others as she was. Together, they were creating something that would stand the test of time. Maggie thought about the women she mentored, how she was teaching them to build their own legacies, just as she had built hers. She thought about the causes she was able to fund, the scholarships she had established to help women in business. She had come so far from the woman who once thought she was only meant to clean up other people's messes. She had created something that was truly hers, something that would live on, not just through the business, but through the example she had set for others. As Maggie leaned back in her chair, she realized something. She wasn't just building a business, she was building a legacy of strength, independence, and empowerment. She smiled to herself, knowing that everything she had gone through, every challenge, every doubt, had led her to this moment. They thought I was weak, Maggie whispered to herself, a quiet satisfaction in her voice. But I showed them that I was stronger than they ever imagined. And for the first time in her life, Maggie knew that she had finally found her place in the world. She was exactly where she was meant to be,